Welcome to the Hillsdale Online Courses Podcast. I'm Kyle Murnen, the Director of Online Learning at Hillsdale College.
And I'm Juan Davalos, the Director of Marketing for Online Learning here at the college. And welcome back to the Hillsdale College Online Courses Podcast. We are on to lecture number 5 today, lecture on morality and virtue. This is a very interesting lecture because you won't hear many lectures about this on the founding or about any period in American history elsewhere, but here with Dr. West and Dr. Azerrad. One of the things that made me think as I was listening to this lecture, I was thinking of a time back in a former grad school of mine where Dallas Willard, a professor of philosophy at USC, was giving a lecture, a public lecture. And we got to the Q&A part of the talk, and a student came up and very sheepishly asked, should the government legislate morality? And he just looked at her, looked at the crowd, looked at her again and said, what else would the government legislate? And of course, everybody laughed. But then he went on to explain the exact same thing that Drs. Azerrad and West will do in this lecture, which is, yes, what else would the government legislate but morality? What the government legislates is based on a moral code. The question is, what moral code are they legislating from? And I think West and Azerrad do a beautiful job of explaining that and having people understand why that's important.
Absolutely. This, for me, is a really fun turn in the course, right? Because we're going to start talking about what are the morals necessary for a free people, for a natural rights republic. And that means that we're getting into topics like, what kind of education do they need to receive? What's the role of religion? How do we view speech and free speech? How do we deal with things like blasphemy, right? So these are getting into some really relevant topics, controversial topics, but deeply important and have a lot to do with how we lead our lives, right? And the kinds of people that we become. What is an American? What is an American? You're going to dig into that in this lecture.
Yeah, and I think something that starts coming up in this lecture, which is very unique in the way that Dr. West thinks about this topic, which I think is the right way of thinking about it. And in an earlier episode, I mentioned how difficult statesmanship is. And I think this is when you really start seeing it, because you have to start thinking about these things. You can't just set up a society and let it go. You have to think about, well, what are we going to do to motivate the right virtues in people, and how are we going to think about education, and how are we going to think about the way that people behave with each other? All those things are important. All those things are things that the founders thought about deeply and that we should think about deeply today.
And I hope you enjoyed today's lecture on morality and virtue in the American founding. And if you're enjoying this lecture, I do hope you go to hillsdale.edu/course and check out our offerings there, our free online courses. One course that this really reminds me of, and it's another favorite of mine, it's actually taught by the president of the college, our boss, Dr. Larry Piarn, and it's on Aristotle's ethics, right? And Aristotle actually comes up a few times here. You can't talk about morality and virtue without talking about Aristotle. He wrote the first book on it. He wrote the Nicomachean Ethics, and it's a fantastic work that really breaks that down, right? What is it to be a virtuous human being? What are the virtues necessary for happiness? Dr. Arn works through that book with a group of students here from Hillsdale College in a unique format. It's a great way to dive into a philosophical work that I think we all agree is deeply important, but might be a little intimidating to read on our own. So I hope you check out our course on Aristotle's Ethics with Dr. Larry Arn, and that's available at hillsdale.edu/course.
So now let's turn to Lecture 5, Morality and Virtue, with Dr. West and Azerrad.
There's a common view today that you hear from libertarian supporters of the founding, and then also conservative critics of the founding, namely that the founders didn't think that the government should legislate morality, that this was a free country, the government just had to secure property rights and let people live freely whichever way they wanted. So the libertarians say, yeah, this is great. And these conservative critics say, well, this is what's wrong with the founding, is that the founders only thought about securing rights and didn't care about virtue.
I mean, this is one of those cases where you're thinking, come on, have you never looked at a document in the founding other than the Declaration of Independence? Come on. I mean, every state and every public official talked very frequently about the question of the moral character of the citizen body, what qualities of character are needed, why it's important for government to promote that. So just as a factual matter, that was just everywhere in the founding. But the second point is, what do these critics think securing these rights means in the first place? That's morality. Jefferson had a great preface to the Virginia criminal laws that he proposed. He said, "Wicked and dissolute men commit violations on the life, liberty, and property of others, and government would be remiss in its basic duty if it didn't punish these people." In other words, immoral people are out there. They're predatory. They're going to trespass on you. They're going to harm you. They're going to steal from you. That's the state of nature, right? Jefferson's saying government's whole point is to create a moral order that has teeth in it for enforcement. I mean, Jefferson's point was there are wicked and dissolute people out there, and it's possible if there's no government around, they get to do what they like. So government has to enforce morality. It's its basic duty in the first place.
Well, what are we supposed to legislate if not morality? I mean, you want to legislate aesthetics, religious opinions, how you should talk to your wife? Of course you legislate morality. The only issue is what kind of morality? Because even libertarians want to legislate morality. They just want to legislate libertarian morality, i.e. the non-aggression principle. So long as you don't punch me, you can pretty much do whatever the hell you want. Whereas it seems to me the founders had a richer understanding of things, and they wanted to use this language, legislate the kind of morality that is necessary to sustain a natural rights republic, to sustain that you basically can't have a natural rights republic without a certain kind of morals.
Yeah. What we have today in our country, in public education, wherever you look, is there's a new view of morality. We call it tolerations, openness,
social justice,
whatever. Yeah, there are various labels for it, but children are told in school, this is what's right, and you need to embrace this. It's very important for you to embrace the idea that it's great to be gay. Not just that you should, leave them alone, but, oh no, you're supposed to say it's a good thing. That's part of modern morality. Part of modern morality, too, is this idea of indiscriminate compassion or humanitarianism, which affects our foreign policy, the idea we have to go out and save the world. And it affects our domestic policy in the tendency in many jurisdictions to have non-punishment of crime or minimal punishment of crime if they're committed by people who are regarded as downtrodden or disadvantaged.
Although the compassion is selectively applied domestically in America because, uneducated whites who are dying of overdoses in flyover country are not entitled to the sympathy of the elites. Too bad for them, or if anything, good riddance. You almost get the sense sometimes.
Yeah, that you do. And which, if you think about it in a broad sense, it's one of the questions in my mind is what is the overall agenda of contemporary liberalism, if not to take away legitimacy and really replace the older American way of life with something they think is much better. And from the point of view of the older middle class America, that feels threatening to them. It feels like the government is making war on them. So, and I think this whole idea of morality, right? It's always out there. Government's always going to be pushing some doctrine of what's right. That's its job. And the founder's point was, well, we need to get that right. We need to make sure that when the government pushes a moral agenda, it's one that's good for people, good for everyone.
So what are the broad contours of the founder's moral agenda, as you put it? Because, something that I'm sure you've realized with students is they think that morality can only mean one thing, whereas there are different moral codes in different societies at different times. Christian morality will be different than Spartan morality. The morality of early America is different than the morality of today, as you pointed out. So what's the moral worldview that the founders thought broadly needed to prevail for America to function as a country?
There are qualities of character as well as conduct that are needed in order for a society to protect the rights of its own citizens and its own people, to allow for the flourishing of individual pursuits of different ways of life, different careers, and so on, but always within a moral framework that they believed was objectively true, independently of government dictate. And so that meant the qualities of character mentioned in the state constitutions included things like justice, meaning obey the law, moderation, meaning don't do things to excess that are likely to harm you or harm others, civility, respect for other people, frugality, and industry, right? Qualities of character that make it possible for you to be an independent citizen, protecting your own rights and respecting the rights of others, right? Frugality, meaning you don't spend everything all at once. You save what you've earned if possible to take care of future needs. And industry, meaning the work ethic. You don't have a right to be taken care of by other people. You need to take care of yourself as much as you can. So the founders thought their own enterprise is worthy, is noble. How many nations in the world have ever even established a regime that basically respects the liberty that is inherent in human nature, that is mostly that people are mostly deprived of because they live under bad governments? They thought what they were doing was something grand. And that's, throughout the founding, you have that reference to that this noble enterprise we're involved in. That's one of the things that makes it worth doing. And connected with that is the idea of sacrifice. The end of the Declaration, we pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Now, and the government's purpose is to secure your life, but in order to establish and create a society that protects the common good and the lives of the citizens, you may have to give up your life. That's the nature of something grand and noble that is not merely bourgeois, as people would claim. So the idea that America is a merely bourgeois, disgusting low. I mean, what's disgusting and what's low is what we see today. Homeless all over the place on the streets, and nobody's actually caring about them at all, although we hear constant prattling about the importance of compassion.
How did they think that the government, more specifically, would promote these virtues in the people? So we talked about in the last segment on how the government went about securing rights.
Yeah.
How did they think the government would, concretely speaking, what are the things the government would do to promote virtue and morality in the people?
Well, in the first instance, of course, there's just the law itself. Like, you will get punished for robbing someone or murdering someone. So you will learn your lesson about what's moral and immoral. And their idea about punishment was punishment, only in the extreme case do we want to kill you. Mostly we want you to reform. The idea of punishment as rehabilitation was fundamental to the founding. It's not meant to be merely punitive. It's meant to make you more willing to be a moral person. If it works, that's ideal. It's the goal. Secondly, of course, the government, through its example, its speeches, its ceremonies, its songs, even the kinds of patriotic songs that used to be sung regularly on celebratory occasions.
You have a very nice little discussion of that in the book.
That was an important thing. Going back to Plato, right? Music has a tremendous influence on the soul. And children exposed to and participating in music that conveys a good moral lesson was part of what they thought government and private society should do. Now, of course, what they mostly expected was virtues and qualities of character would be promoted not so much by the punitive justice system of government or anything government did, but mostly by private life. Your religion, your church, your community, your family, your friends, and your schools. They were all expected to be, whether public or private, to be promoting these goals.
What about censorship? What role did they think the government had in banning obscene discourse or music that is morally corrosive?
Well, I don't know if they ever spoke specifically about music of that kind, but certainly it was part of the older common law inherited from colonial times, and which the founders approved of, in this case, to ban obscenity or talk that would end up harming the community at large.
And what would get covered under obscenity? I mean,
they talked about obscene pictures, writings. There was some back then. Mostly that was discouraged by public opinion. Like you couldn't have that kind of stuff around. People would ostracize you, or you would be regarded as something wrong with you if you were circulating such kinds of things in communities. And for a long time in America, that was generally true.
It's no secret that Americans are more divided than ever. And it's not just over what policies will improve our great country. No, it's over whether America is great at all, whether America deserves our love. That's why Imprimis is so important. Imprimis looks at the issues of the day from a constitutional perspective, reminding citizens always of our great heritage of liberty. For more than 50 years, Imprimis has featured speeches from the smartest conservative thinkers and writers at Hillsdale events. These days, Hillsdale publishes people like Molly Hemingway, Andy Puzder, Harmeet Dillon, and Chris Rufo. Over 6.4 million American households and businesses receive Imprimis absolutely free. And I urge you to sign up for it today at no charge. To get your free lifetime subscription, go to hillsdale.edu/lifetime right now. Or text the word Imprimis to 71844 and we'll send you a link to sign up for your free lifetime subscription. That's IMPRIMIS to 71844.
So there were limits to free speech.
For sure.
What about blasphemy? Because on the one hand, we're a free country with, I guess, religious liberty and the right to pursue the truth. I know that there were some laws on the books at the time of the founding banning blasphemy.
Right.
Is that in keeping with the theory of the founding, or was that a holdover from the British tradition that they didn't get around to eliminating?
Well, there are arguments on both sides on that question, and there were many people even then, as well as many scholars today. Most scholars today would say, of course, it was a violation of the basic principle of freedom of speech. At the time, it was more controversial because there is a kind of religion of the community in America. And that was at a time when America was predominantly Protestant, or at least Christian. There were Jews present, but it wasn't a big factor. But mostly it was understood that the religion of the community, de facto, not that it's forced by law, but was going to be Protestant Christianity. And they thought that public vilification is the way they put it. Vilification of the religion of the community should not be tolerated. There should be laws against that. Meaning, in one case, famous case, Jesus Christ was a bastard and his mother was a whore. Making a big deal out of that kind of statement in public. Now, of course, today would say nobody would care today. You'd say, well, it's the kind of thing we just say. We're allowed to say it. They thought, look, you got to be respectful of public opinion, respectful of the opinion of the community. And they felt the same way about obscenity laws. It was more like being respectful of what parents want their children to be exposed to.
So that case, that statement you mentioned, that's something that could be successfully banned or prosecuted under blasphemy, according to the understanding of the founding?
That was the argument made by the judge in that case, who I believe was Chancellor Kent, the chief judge in New York State at the time. His point was, look, this is not the kind of free speech that is appropriate for a community like the United States. Now, he made a distinction between open and vicious vilification and academic discussions of religion, such as Thomas Paine's book, Age of Reason.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, Paine, who wrote this book, basically, I don't believe the Bible is true. I believe these stories all stitched together, by later editors, and it's nothing supernatural about it. That book was banned in England, but in America it was regarded as, well, that's on the edge of that's academic discussion. He made a learned argument about that, and that should not be banned. But what should be banned is that somebody going around in public and making a spectacle of himself, denouncing Christians and the fundamental beliefs of Christians.
That's a very interesting distinction. The one we haven't mentioned is, what about libel and slander? I mean, the First Amendment, we have a right to our reputation. You talk about this in the book.
Yeah,
and therefore,
that's
you're not permitted to go around town maliciously slandering or defaming someone.
That's one of those features of the founding that is mostly neglected today. People don't notice that it was often spoken of as a natural right to your reputation, and certainly was regarded as a right that should be protected by government, because your ability to live your life in the way you like can be greatly harmed by just what people say about you. And so at that time in America, if a woman were widely denounced as a whore, that's libelous. I mean, that would likely interfere with her chances for a good marriage, if that was a general opinion about a particular girl.
Was truth a defense in a libel statement, in a libel lawsuit?
But I should mention, beyond the case I mentioned, there's also the case of, let's say, a doctor. And if the claim is made this doctor's patients are all dying because he's a quack, that's a libelous statement.
Or what if it's true?
Now, if it's true, if it's a private case, if it's private, even if it's true, it's libel, and you can be sued.
What do you mean by private? So this doctor, I mean, he's killed, people are dying at his practice.
So,
I go around town saying, don't go see him.
Yeah.
He's terrible.
He's an individual who's a private person and has a right to his reputation. Now, of course, he should be prosecuted for killing patients. That's a separate legal question, if in fact he was doing that. But the idea was, people's reputations, there has to be extremely good reason why you would vilify someone. And the example that they mostly accepted was, if it's a government official who's, let's say, running for election, then it becomes different. And the truth should be a defense, they thought, even though in most libel cases it was not a defense.
Really? But I guess that's the first thing you've said so far that really shocks me, that some doctor, people are dying with him, and I write an expose in a local newspaper. He could win a lawsuit claiming that I've slandered him, even though people are dying with him?
That's my understanding. Look, you're talking about turning something that's a general principle into a legalistic principle.
Yeah.
The way things worked in earlier America, of course, was more by consensus. It was actually, in many cases, not that easy to win a libel suit, although it could happen. But the consensus of the community would have been very important in determining whether a jury, if you were accused of libeling this doctor, whether a jury would hold you accountable.
Mm-hmm.
They might do something like, if it actually went to a jury, they might do something like, yeah, you're legally liable. You have to pay a $1 judgment, to the plaintiff. I don't know, something like that. I think it's important for us to remember that although we talk a lot about the founders' legal enactments and constitutional arrangements, much of what happened in earlier America was by consensus and informal. And we're so used to the idea of everything, dotting every I and crossing every T in regard to filling out forms and bureaucracy and procedure. That's not the way it was. They did try to maintain, though, the basic goals of government that I've been mentioning throughout.
So we can't really have a conversation about the role of morality at the time of the founding and not talk about religion.
Well, wait a minute. With one other topic, which is the topic of how were the higher virtues, the tougher virtues, encouraged. Because what I noticed when I looked into this was the founders made a distinction between the social and Republican virtues, which every citizen should be able to do mostly, basically. Like every citizen can be just, follow the law. Every citizen can be moderate, don't be a drunkard. Citizens can be respectful of each other's rights and have civility. And what they can't all do is to have the virtues of courage in war and prudence and statesmanship. But those virtues are virtues too, and every well-governed country needs those as well. Now, with regard to courage, they thought that with respect to the kind of courage that a man would be able to exhibit, that's not to be expected of women. Women are more timid, they're likely to run away, and also we think they need to be preserved more than men because of their importance as future mothers or present mothers. And with regard to the quality of leadership, statesmanship, that was understood as something which should be encouraged. Obviously, examples shown. Students should be taught about the great men of their society. All of that. One of the early textbooks was written by Noah Webster. He was an indefatigable entrepreneur of school textbooks. And it was his agenda to get Americans to stop using books from England, which exalted the old monarchy and the aristocracy, and get them to use books written by Americans for Americans, with stories about founders, with stories about how our Constitution works, stories about daily life, and what is it? How is it that young boys and young girls should behave to prepare themselves for adult life? His textbooks were full of stories like this and essays. And his books were widely adopted all over America in the educational system of the day. It's quite really impressive. So all the virtues would have been covered in those stories and examples that they were formerly used maybe to teach English, to teach grammar, but they would also carry moral lessons. Just as today, we have stories about gay parents, transgender parents, meant to convey a moral lesson of a very different kind.
So tell us a little bit more about education, and also while we're at it, higher education. How did the view today is, my God, where to even begin? The schools are just conveyor belts to move kids along because no child shall be left behind. They don't learn all that much. And then everyone needs to go to college where it's a choose your own adventure and everyone gets an A for showing up. How broadly did the founders think about public and private education and then higher education?
They thought education, they thought government's purpose in education should be limited to the kind of education and the extent of it that actually does promote securing the rights of all. So education always, in their view, had to have a public purpose that was going to be good for the community. So what that meant primarily was elementary school. That people had to know, they didn't know how to read, how to write, how to do basic calculation, arithmetic. They had to know what their basic rights and duties are. And they were expected to do some reading that had conveyed also some sense of what has happened in previous history, American history as well as other history, to kind of warn them about bad things that can happen to you and when governments are mismanaged, and good things too. So that was the kind of education they thought that every citizen should be provided an opportunity to have that. And ideally they should either attend schools or at least be homeschooled in a way that made sure they had those basic skills and information. And it was done. That was what they did. Especially in the northern states, schools were set up, public schools, not so much where everyone was expected to attend, but at least the poor. Schools for the poor, others could afford their own. But sometimes there were public schools where everyone would attend. In some states, there was a variety of solutions to that. In the South, not so much. The Southerners tended to live more apart. Farms were far away from each other. But as far as high school and university, there was some involvement of government in both of those, but never with the expectation that anyone much would go beyond elementary. You were expected to have a significant degree of talent to attend a high school or a college or university, unless your parents had money. And fine, then they can send you whatever. But the idea was, as far as people who didn't have the money, and therefore who would have to be on scholarship of some kind, that was limited by talent. And now, again, not always followed, but this was the general idea of it. High schools tended to be more private, but sometimes they were publicly funded to some degree. And Same with colleges. Many private colleges, but also many states, I think even most states, had some provision in the law for higher education, for university. That would be for the leaders of society to learn something much more, like science. Leaders would learn agricultural techniques, things that could be helpful for the community at large, and also to help shape and form their character.
So not gender studies, presumably.
Not genders, no, that's right.
So the big topic we haven't discussed so far on how the founders thought about the government's role in promoting morality is religion. Everyone knows that in America, there's a First Amendment, that people have religious liberty. I think you must have had this experience. People are a bit surprised to hear that the founders did not think that religious liberty was incompatible with government support of religion. So that's forbidden. We're not supposed to have an established church at the national level. But we had established churches in, I believe, 9 of the original 13 states. And you have a really interesting discussion in the book on how you explain how this is not incompatible with religious liberty, which I think will shock the sensibilities of many today. So can you present to us the founders' argument?
Well, what they thought was crucial to religious liberty was free exercise of religion. As you basically have the right to be of whatever religion you want and join whatever church you want or not join any church if you don't want. Basically, there had to be this fundamental right to be left alone in your religious practices with some limitations on regard to using religion, let's say, to excuse crime or something like that. The way jihad is sometimes understood in the Muslim world, the right to go out and kill infidels or whatever. That sort of religious view, they would have said no.
Or the Mormons with polygamy later, that the Supreme Court said,
right,
we can't tolerate that.
We can't have polygamy. We're going to have monogamous marriage here. And interestingly, they made rational arguments. They made natural law arguments for that, which we can talk about later. But as for the question you raised, government support, yes, many states did inherit from their colonies these practices of funding specific denominations. And that continued on after the founding, especially in New England, where each community was authorized to pick a Protestant teacher of religion and pay him out of taxpayer funds. Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Connecticut especially were the 3 most famous for that. And so the question came up in court, like, is this a violation of religious liberty? It came up in New Hampshire as well as Massachusetts. And the answer that the courts gave in both cases was, money's not your conscience. You're paying a tax for something you don't approve of, maybe, but that's okay. You're still allowed to have your own religion. Public schools, you may be taxed to fund a public school teacher that you think does a bad job. I can testify. Yes, I do that here in Michigan. I fund all those people at the University of Michigan who I think are doing a bad job in many cases. But you've lost the election, basically. If you win the next election, you can pick your own teacher of religion and have that person funded. They viewed it, that is, the people who defended this kind of taxpayer funding did it in that way. And there were typically opt-out provisions for people who were not Congregationalists. You could show they belonged to some other church or something. And although, again, there were sometimes cases where people were being forced to pay the tax and they didn't want to. Now, although I do think that the arguments can be made that are convincing about that, as was made in the cases I mentioned, it was also hugely controversial, especially as America became more and more religiously diversified. Mm-hmm. Catholic immigration in the early 19th century, of course, made that a lot more controversial. Even in New England, you had the Baptists and others who were beginning to form their own denominations. So although it was arguably permissible under the founders' understanding, it was controversial, and it was dropped in all states by the 1830s, I think. And some people at the time of the founding, like Jefferson famously, thought it was in conflict with religious liberty for someone to be taxed to pay for something that they didn't agree with, that violated their sense of religious conscience. An argument that I don't believe Jefferson himself ever was able to make in a consistent way. But certainly he was expressing a widespread view that of this is a bad idea. Let's not be funding specific denominations.
What about rhetorical support for religion? There's a tendency today to have what Father Newhouse called the naked public square. That in the public square, we shouldn't talk about God or religion. That's divisive. And that, if anything, the First Amendment forbids it for government officials to talk about religion and God. How did the founders think about the question of could government officials exhort Americans to repent,
Yes.
to go to church?
Yeah, they did it all the time, of course. People, I think every presidential inaugural up to the present day has some reference to God or religion. It's just there. People understand that's something the government can do. Even today, it's still relatively not controversial when some public official in a speech says, thank God, or, we wish, we're grateful to God for our many blessings. And even Jefferson, even Madison did that sort of thing in their own public speeches. It was understood this is appropriate for a community that has a common consensus. There is such a thing as God, and he deserves to be worshipped.
Why do you say even Jefferson and even Madison? Because of their anti-clerical bias?
Yeah. And their claim, like Jefferson's claim, no taxpayer money should ever be used in support of government support of religion. Well, what about you? You're a president. You're being funded by the taxpayer. And he's then saying things like very nice things, pro-religion, pro-Christianity. In both of his inaugural addresses, he has a lot to say that's favorable towards the prevailing religious views of Americans. The other way, though, in which public officials continue to promote a kind of consensus generic Protestantism for a long time in America was through public schools. Prayers in school, Bible readings, talking about Scripture, talking about basic Protestant tenets of faith. This went on in most states up until the 1960s. And it was that kind of public support, you could call it even taxpayer support of religion, was relatively not controversial outside Catholic circles. Now, the Catholics didn't like it, and one of the reasons why there was a whole Catholic parochial school system that developed during all that period up to the 1960s was because they felt like, I don't want my kid to be taught the Protestant version of Christianity. I want him in a Catholic school. Reasonably enough. And of course, they felt bitter, like, why am I paying taxes? It's the same concern they had as the people who didn't like the taxpayer funding of individual denominations. Why am I paying taxes to support this school that teaches my kid to be a Protestant? So it was controversial, but it was relatively mild during that whole period.
What's crazy about today when I look at it is that the consensus elite view is that religion and Christianity in particular is dangerous. You need to not talk about it, not subsidize it. Whereas the secular religions of the age, feminism, critical race theory, sexual liberation, transgenderism, that gets subsidized, promoted, pushed everywhere. So traditional religion is boxed in and deprived of support. And what has replaced it for the elites in many parts of American society, these secular religions, that gets promoted and subsidized.
Right, which is another way of saying that government inevitably always supports religion and always supports morality of one kind or another.
That's it.
And it doesn't really change it if you take the word God out of it and just call it, and just have the slogan, transgender is sacred. You still have this promotion of a particular moral/religious view everywhere.
Yeah, and the only question is, which morality?
And one of the things that's interesting about this, why did the United States government, both at state and national level, turn against the public affirmation of Christianity? It didn't really happen until post-World War II. And I think the answer is because Christianity came to be seen as being opposed to the principles of justice and morality as they began to be understood in that post-war environment.
You mean the new understanding?
The new understanding. So, for example, if Christians are taught, thou shalt not steal, does that mean then that the welfare state is a kind of violation of Christian law? That was a concern. on the part. I don't mean that they literally made that argument, but they wanted to get people away from the idea that somehow or other property rights are to be respected and defended in order to justify the new orientation towards property, which is redistribution to governments, to groups that government designates as disadvantaged. And the same thing is true with regard to sex and sexual liberation. As that became more and more important to the elites of our society in the 40s and 50s and 60s, then Christianity came to be seen as the enemy. Oh, because thou shalt not commit adultery. That's a principle that had to be overturned in order to justify the sexual revolution.
Well, that's the perfect note to end this conversation on, because it'll tee up perfectly the next one, where we're going to turn to how the founders thought about sex and marriage.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Hillsdale Online Courses Podcast. If you want to continue learning about America's founding or other topics, please visit hillsdale.edu/course. There you can find over 40 free online courses, including American Citizenship and Its Decline with Victor Davis Hanson, Ancient Christianity, The Rise and Fall of the Roman Republic, and many more. The courses include additional readings, study guides, fully produced videos, and you can chat with your fellow students on a dedicated forum. Upon completing a course, you will also get a certificate. All our courses are free because we believe that a virtuous citizen is the best defense for liberty. So pursue the education necessary for freedom and happiness at hillsdale.edu/course today. That's hillsdale.edu/course. Thank you for listening.